Well, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further in hopes that it becomes more helpful, applicable, encouraging for you and your life and your faith. I'm Jeremy. I'm the content director here at North Point. And as always, make sure to subscribe. It just helps more people hear the content in this podcast, and it helps us know that this is helpful for you. And last week we were in part 4 of Nothing Else. Almost said 3, but it's been part 4. And I'm sitting here with Buck, our lead pastor. Buck, how you doing?
Not too bad.
Not too bad.
Just hanging.
Yeah, and this past week you talked about happiness.
Yes.
And you went over a couple things that make you happy. You talked about clean garage, which I watched your kids last week, so I can attest to the fact that it is not
It is kind of messy.
clean right now.
Yeah, I know. Well, and I'm worried this weekend, like thinking about, what I was saying, I worked on it.
Did you?
Yeah, but our Jill's uncle gave us a refrigerator. So we have now 2 refrigerators in our garage, and I have no space for it. So that's like in the middle of everything. And he also gave us a massage chair, like a really fancy one that like squeezes your legs.
Did that go in the garage or did that go in the bedroom?
No, it's right in the middle of our living room, and our boys are like fighting over it. And it's like, what are our pain tolerances? Because it squeezes like your calves and your feet. And so it's a really fancy one.
Oh, one of those ones, yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's the whole thing. So you're like in this like space age thing. And apparently they didn't use it. So they were like, do you want it? We're like, yeah, we'll take it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so.
When I was in middle school, we used to go to the mall. The mall was the place to hang out, which is crazy to think about now, considering COVID and all that.
Yeah.
But we'd go to the mall, and there was this one store. It's called Brookstone, I think.
Oh, yeah, that's a cool store.
I've gotten kicked out of that like 2 or 3 times when I was in middle school because we'd go in there and like just cycle between all the chairs, and then there'd be people who wanted to sit down, and they knew we were never going to buy a chair.
No.
We just wanted to like do the massage chairs.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They're so cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
my boys, like Jonathan, it's so funny because he's just so skinny and little, and he just swallowed up. And he's like in this like G mode, whatever, like, no gravity. And he's just like closing his eyes.
That's awesome.
And he's just all shaking because the whole thing's moving. So it's
That's
cool.
awesome.
Yeah, it's fun.
So clean garage makes you happy. New massage chair is happy. You talked about having lunch with your boys. You talked about Jill, friends. What's like another just silly thing that makes you happy?
Well, so something that's new for me is chess. And when you were watching our boys a couple weekends ago or whatever,
I played chess with them.
Yeah, so we're into that right now, and so they're all learning it. And I'm just competitive, so I really like beating Jill. And so it's like, we're beating the boys, and I'm like, there's no mercy. I'm going to move my whatever. I don't even know what the little pawns, and I don't know all the technical names. But we're having a lot of fun with that. And it really does. Like, I love games, blackjack. We have our, poker set at the house, so I love that.
Yeah.
Those things are all like, golf used to make me happy. I just haven't played it in a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to play it like, all the time.
I mean, if you were a pro golfer, ideally at some point it made you happy, right?
Yes. Yeah, you can lose that because it becomes just so
a job
like,
and,
and my,
the pressure.
Yeah, and my perfectionism, that's in me that, I've been wrestling with for a long time. It's like, I must be perfect, must hit it perfect, make the perfect putt. And
Yeah.
that'll drive you insane. And so, but I do have lots of really cool memories. Just, the sun's going down, like, and I'm just alone on the golf course, and it's a perfect sunset, and the background and the green grass and the water, and it's just, the fields, and no one's out there. It's just like such kind of tranquil, like cool moments.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I've never once thought about perfectionism when it comes to golf. When I'm on the golf course, I am just like, please let it go in somewhat of the direction I want it to go. Yeah.
Yeah, just that way.
Yes.
Yeah.
East is what I'm going for.
Yeah, that's
and
good.
Then it goes west.
You got to start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump in.
Okay.
So we talked about happiness this past week, and you shared this quote. You shared a lot about King Solomon. Lived 3,000 years ago, king of Israel, and he wrote Ecclesiastes, which is a little bit depressing, but there's a purpose behind it because it really points to what the meaning of life is, where we actually find happiness. And he tried everything. And you talked through this a little bit, but I love the quote that you had at the end from the TED Talk with Dan Gilbert. And I'm just going to read it because I think it helps us get into our first question.
Yeah.
But he believes that in our ardent, lifelong pursuit of happiness, most of us have the wrong map. In the same way that optical illusions fool our eyes and fool everyone's eyes in the same way, he argued that our brains systematically misjudge what will make us happy. And these quirks in our cognition make humans very poor predictors of our own bliss. Which essentially means we all want to be happy.
Yeah.
That's the destination we'd like to go, and we're all like driving in a completely different direction, and we don't know it, right? And so we talked about that. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we misjudge happiness so much?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of responses to this. I think one of those is cultural. You and I have been to Africa. Kenya.
Yep.
And it's really cool to see what we're doing around the world, and people's generosity and investment. Like when I say, hey, you're really making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah.
Through a Mosaic, our ministry here, and Mick and Tracy Hooper lead the whole thing. They've done a remarkable job.
Right.
I mean, we've seen that to where we go to the culture in Kenya, and they're playing with like used Coke bottle caps. And that brings a lot of happiness and joy and contentment.
Yeah.
And one of the things I think we're shocked by is what brought them happiness is far different than what brings us happiness in our culture.
Yeah.
So I think, I think culture certainly has an impact on that. And culture will determine what we chase. If it's right or wrong, it really doesn't matter. It's, so much of like, hey, when I was 5, this is what I've always known.
Yeah.
So what we always know is what we chase. And I think, the other piece, I alluded to this on Sunday, but I do think there's, it's tricky. And I think Dan alludes to this in his book called Stumbling on Happiness, is that it's a stimulant. Like happiness is like it begins to engage like the prefrontal cortex, which Dan talks about a lot of the science behind that, what it's doing to your brain, and it's saying, man, this feels really good. So like, hey, if I win chess, that feels really good. So therefore, logically, we think if a little feels good, a lot's going to really satiate or bring, bring meaning or bring that long-term lasting happiness. So that's true when it comes to a job. That's true when it comes to money. That's true when it comes to sex. That's true when it comes to all these things. But all of those are short-sighted. If the research is correct, all of those are stimulants. Those are catalysts. Those are short-term happiness things. And the danger is we can pursue those and chase those and think the more we get, we're going to be happy. But ultimately, that's not what the research says, or that's not what the scriptures would say. And that's cool. Those go hand in hand, or are actually going to bring you happiness. So I think that's part of why that happens, is because we feel it. It's tangible. It's experiential. And it's like, wow, if I got this big bonus, like all of a sudden it's like, man, this is awesome. And even like, so yesterday I was talking to my son Sam, and I shared that lottery example. Like you win the lottery or become a paraplegic. The research says really, regardless of what's happening, like these activities, and he absolutely is like, Dad, that's not true. If I won the lottery, I would be happy a year later, and like 5 years later, and 10 years. And I thought, there it is. Like, I get it. We want to push back. There's a logical pushback because the short-term stimulants that we experience. So I think that, as Dan says, it puts the wrong map in our brain.
Yeah.
And we chase the wrong map, and we can do that our whole lives, especially the more successful we are.
Yeah. It's interesting every time, because we've been to Kenya through Mosaic a couple times together. And so we've also seen people go for the first time on multiple occasions. And it's just interesting that they have the same conclusion every time. It's like, I came thinking I was going to give something to these people, and they showed me something I'd never realized.
So much. Like,
they are the happiest people on the planet. It's just hard to find a Kenyan that's not happy in some way. And the people that we met, at least, Yeah. And they have nothing. And these kids are lining up to get a piece of bread from the church there, and they're the happiest kids you've ever met.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it goes to another thought that hits my mind is happiness, it's a paradox. It really is. And a paradox is like what's before you is not actually going to give you what you desire. It's beyond what's before you. Like it doesn't really make sense. And it's not logical initially until you really have to think about it. And Jesus was full of paradoxes. I mean, it's in one of his famous statements in Luke chapter 9, he says, if anyone comes after me, he must deny himself daily and take up his cross. And he says, if you try to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life, you're going to find it.
Yeah.
And so that's very similar to happiness. It's like if you quit chasing the very things, like, in terms of you still need to support your family, do all those things. It's great to, have success. Those are wonderful. But if you go, that's not where happiness is going to be found, and you quit chasing it there and you chase it in the right things, the things that actually lead to happiness, it's really a paradox. So it's hard to do that.
Yeah.
But it does lead to the very thing we desire. But
Yeah.
I think it makes it hard, and I think that's why we chase the wrong things a lot.
Sure. Embracing this paradox is tough, like you just said. And, I think for men specifically, one of the things that we struggle with most is kind of attaching our happiness to our identity being found in work or money or power or intelligence. And it is so difficult to detach those things. So what would you say to somebody who's listening and they feel like their happiness is hitched to their work or their money or their power? What would you say would help them find happiness not in those things, but in something more lasting?
Yeah, gosh. This I want to be careful the way I say it. But I think this is perhaps one of the greatest deceptions that is extraordinarily difficult to break free from. And what I mean by that is if you have enough short-term stimulants, I think you can pursue that a long time. And, think of somebody who's got, on drugs. It's like, man, drugs are doing it for me. Drugs are doing it for me. And they know, like there's almost at a soulish level, they know this is not right. They know there's got to be a way that's free from these drugs that can provide some rest and peace and meaning and happiness. But it just keeps doing it for them and doing it for them and doing it for them. And you can see people who are addicted to drugs for a long, long, long time. And as much logic as you use, as much rationale as you may use, it's going to take a life event for oftentimes for somebody to go
like a rock bottom kind of event.
Yeah. To wake up to there's a statement I've shared with you before that says, it's not our weakness that gets us, it's our blind spots. So you can go through life blind for a long time. And the danger with the short-term happiness kind of syndrome, which I'll call it, is that the more talented, the more successful, the more driven, the more money perhaps you get, you can be on that happiness train, like that stimulant train, for a long, long time. And I think that's the danger in it. Because it's paying off, but you got to go more, you got to go bigger, you've got to, kind of raise the risk, you got to climb the ladder, you got to go more and more and more. And I'm not saying ambition isn't good. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying, but if you're chasing that for happiness, that's the danger in it, and that gets really hard. So then I would say, if you're listening and you're going, I think that's me. Like, I think the truth is, if you ask me an honest question to quantify where I'm getting my happiness, it would be in my work. It would be in those things. It would be my successes. And I would say two things perhaps would have to happen to break you free of that. One would not be good, and it's the lesser option. It's some sort of a tragic circumstance. Yeah, you lose all your money. And I in my role as a pastor, I sit on the other side of people who go through these really difficult circumstances, and my heart breaks every time. And when I sit on the other side of people who are going through this, it's like everything is stripped away. Everything I've put my meaning and my happiness in is gone. And my career, it's gone. My finances, they're gone. Whatever I was holding on to, it's gone. And in those moments, it's like that's what breaks you free. It's like all of a sudden you wake up. It's like all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, the things I've been chasing. They were, like Solomon says, chasing the wind. Like, I cannot believe I was doing that. And, the cost and the regrets and all those kind of things. So one, it's some sort of pivotal, traumatic, tragic circumstance, which I do not want for anyone. I think there's a better way, and I think the better way is Jesus. I think, one of the things that over time breaks us free from this is a deeper understanding and a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's like a paradigm shift to go, oh my gosh, like all the talents I'm given, the resources I'm given, those are actually given from God. And he's the owner of all these things, and he's entrusted them to me, which is pretty cool to go like, if you have a lot of resources, one of the things is to go, God's given you that for a reason. And to know that my identity is not found in those resources, my identity is already found in Christ. Like he's already spoken to who I am. I don't have to go prove that. And to think about, gosh, the talents you've given me, the resources you've given me. And then he says, leverage these resources, not only for your enjoyment, which is pretty cool, but also for the advancement of my kingdom. Mm-hmm. So for, good purpose is to love people the way I've loved you, to make disciples, introduce people to this incredible good news that they can have peace with God through Jesus Christ, and leverage your resources to do that. And now all of a sudden, a relationship with Jesus, that is a catalytic event. Oftentimes that is a turning point, a pivot point in our lives to go, and it begins to break us free from, oh my gosh, I was putting my happiness in money, putting my happiness in success, putting my happiness in my talents, putting my happiness in pleasure. And really that's a chasing the wind, as Solomon teaches. So I think those two events, a big tragic event, which I wouldn't want, or a much better solution is really a deeper, or to pursue, or to start a relationship with Jesus.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that probably is an outcome when you start a relationship with Jesus is you begin to redefine a lot of the things in your life, mm-hmm. and the purpose behind those things, the purpose behind your marriage and your family and all, and probably for somebody listening, if they redefine what happiness looks like, mm-hmm. within the context of that relationship with Jesus, I'm sure it's going to change a lot of things too. Mm-hmm. It's going to change the way they view their work or let's say the talent that they have, because if they redefine what happiness looks like in the context of their relationship with Jesus, then their talent is what God gave them. And if their talent isn't the thing that leads to happiness, there's this freedom to be, okay, well, if I'm not the best of the best, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like I can live life and still be happy and content and fulfilled.
Right.
Because I'm not finding it there.
Exactly. And it's not saying don't work hard.
Right.
Don't be successful. Hey, go be the best of the best. Like if God's given you the talent to go do it, but don't hang your happiness and meaning and significance and identity on that stuff.
Yeah.
You're already, have what it takes. You're already, as I've said a lot on Sundays, like you're already a son of God. You're already a daughter.
Yeah.
You're already worth it.
Yeah.
You already matter.
That's really good. Mm-hmm. I think, for somebody, you ended, Solomon, what he said is at the end of the day, fear God and obey his commands, mm-hmm. right? And you brought that to Jesus being God-man, Jesus being God in flesh. And so when we look at Jesus and we try to shift our happiness to him, mm-hmm. it can be difficult because we've been living life one way, mm-hmm. and now we try to live life a different way. But really it's about letting that truth sink. For the 18 inches, my counselor said the greatest gap in life is the 18 inches from your head to your heart.
So true.
Because we know a lot of things, but it's so hard to let them sink down into our being and our souls and who we are. And so what can we do to help this truth that Jesus, God, fearing God brings happiness? What can we do to help this truth sink down 18 inches from our head to our heart?
Well, I don't want to repeat what I said on Sunday, because what I said on Sunday really, hopefully stands on its
making
alone.
Jesus personal, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But I'm going to repeat it. I just, and what I really want you to think about, and if you're listening, I really want you to think about this. It's like any kind of relationship. Like when I just met you, it's like, hey, Jeremy, and hey, Buck, and, it's like we know each other at a certain level. And there's only so much depth and so much you can glean and I can glean at a surface level. But the more that we spend time, the more that we're intentional, the more that, you're authentic, the more that I'm authentic, the more that, it's not like, hey, I have to impress you. It's just like I can be like there's a level of trust that develops between us. Like now we can really begin to benefit in terms of what relationships offer in this world. Mm-hmm. And, the Harvard study of adult development says, your relationships are really one of the greatest catalysts to happiness. But a relationship takes time. A relationship takes intentionality. And so you can know things about Jesus in your head, but to get them to your heart, it's like I can know things about you in my head, but to get them to my heart, I must know you more. And so, to expand on what I said Sunday, I would say there's multiple ways we can develop or grow in our relationship with Jesus Christ. I think, listening to podcasts, just like Overtime, it's one great way to go, man, I'm understanding Jesus at a different level. Mm-hmm. I'm beginning to grow in my insight. I'm beginning to grow in my wisdom. I'm understanding, the Bible at a different level. listening to different sermons. Hopefully, I hope people listen to what I'm saying and my sermons and the things, I work hard for all those, but there are fantastic communicators all around the world. I would highly suggest, listening to a whole lot of different, sermons and teachings about Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
I think that inspires our relationship to go, wow, I just didn't know that.
Yeah.
I think
really quick, if somebody's hearing that, who would be like your top 3 that you'd point them to?
Well, my mentor from a distance, Andy Stanley.
Yeah.
I think he's pretty good.
Yeah, he's all right.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I think Tim Keller is another guy that I listen to a whole lot. I think, what I mentioned on Sunday, Judah Smith, he's just funny.
Yeah, he's really funny.
Yeah, I think Craig Rochelle from Life Church is a guy I was listening to this morning, and he was on a podcast about leadership, talking to John Maxwell, and I was like, man, these, and I've listened to those guys. There's a whole lot more.
Sure.
But
no, I think that's good. I just wanted to give a couple of examples for people to look up if they want to.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So information is like, the more I can understand about you, the more context I get about you, I grow my relationship with you. Yeah. And the more curious I am. So I would say that would be one. I said another, I think, would be just private disciplines. I think those, to grow your faith is to go, what are you doing privately to really grow your relationship with Christ? And I mentioned this on Sunday, but I think, reading the Bible is so incredibly important. Reading the letters about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think are really important. I think when it comes to private discipline, praying should be like breathing. Mm-hmm. And it may sound weird, to hear that initially, but I mean, the goal or the hope is to do what Paul says, to pray continually. It's like, man, I wake up and I'm like, God, thank you for this day. And it's fine if like that's not your routine. You shouldn't feel bad, but like that's kind of where you want to get to. And the idea is to go, as I walk into a meeting at work, as I walk into a meeting at school, or to a test at school, as I walk into this relationship that I'm nervous about, as I walk into into my house after work, God, give me the strength to see my wife or see my husband or see my kids the way you see them. And it's just this like continual like progression like this, and it begins to build that relationship. Yeah. And you begin to experience how God answers prayer when it's not a flare prayer. Sure. Nothing wrong with a flare prayer, but those are quick and they may happen once a week. But it's like, man, there's a continual. So to grow in those private disciplines, I think memorizing certain sections of the scriptures. Yeah. I think there's so much that's in us that God will use, but if it's not in us, I think that's another private discipline. I think even fasting. I mean, that's definitely a church thing, and feels like, ooh, that's pretty religious. But I think even when you fast, you kind of withdraw or you cease from doing the necessary, and it allows God to kind of step in the gap at the necessary, and your reliance on Him. It's just remembering who He is, and so there's I think private disciplines. I think you can get into growing your faith or growing your relationship with Christ through serving. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've led a small group or been serving in ministry, and I'm the one actually learning far more. Yeah. I'm like, the questions people are asking me, the opportunity to sit and be with somebody who's going through hardships, the opportunity to be able to teach. Like, I learned so much more about Jesus in that. I think hard circumstances can bring, can grow our faith, because that's the fork in the road. Like, what are we going to do? Yeah. Am I going to trust and have confidence, which is faith? Faith is confidence that God will do what He's promised to do. Yeah. So I know that feels like a little bit of a repeat on Sunday, but I cannot emphasize that more. To say, to move Jesus from a concept to a personal relationship. We know in life you can't do that without being intentional. Yeah. Without activity. And the less activity I have with you, the less I call you, the less we spend time. I'm like, man, there seems to be a distance with Jeremy. And the more intentional I am, I'm like, hey, tell me about this week and what's going on. And hey, how would you handle this? And man, I'm challenged here. And the more I engage with that and invite you into that, the more I'm like, man, I know Jeremy really, really well. Gosh, right. He's such an encouragement to my heart. You know when to encourage, you know when to listen, you know when to go like, Buck, you're off your rocker, because there's personal relationship. The same is true with Jesus. And I think that's the greatest thing, to move him from your head to your heart. Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And I think, too, I would just add one in there as well. And this is more of a personal one for me, but when I think about fearing God and, finding the meaning of life, happiness in fearing God and obeying His commands, kind of what's always connected for me, being in awe of God. One of the things that's been so helpful is just listening to music that's about Him, and just
brings to life truths. That's why, we sing on Sundays. I mean, we don't do it because churches have done it forever. Actually, like in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, like you hear them talk about how they sang songs and spiritual songs to encourage one another. And, I just think for me, sometimes I get in the car and I just like, I got to put on some music that really just brings me back to home base and reminds me of what's true. And the same is true of why we do it on Sunday too. I love seeing people connect with God through music because they're experiencing that fear of him, that awe of him. He is unchanging. He is faithful. He is the only thing that we can look at in our life that's going to bring us that contentment and joy and happiness.
It's really, it's the idea of remembering. Yeah. And I'll share one example because I think, I'm trying to picture myself. If I'm listening to what I'm saying, which, a lot of times you'll see me do, and I'm like, the way I said that, here's my questions. Or if I'm playing devil's advocate, I'm like, But one example, tangible example, is, spending time reading the scriptures. I read the story of Jesus with a woman caught in adultery and, how that became personal to me. And I've shared this with you before. But, for me, there was somebody in my life who did something really, really hurtful. And it was like holding back my happiness. Like, I wasn't happy. I was angry. I was hurt. I just wanted vengeance. And, I carried that for months. And so if you were like, Buck, you preached a happy sermon. Are you happy? I'm like, nope, I am not happy.
Yeah.
And so, but part of the disciplines is, I was reading the scriptures and I read this story. And for whatever reason, it's like God met me in that moment. And in this story, Jesus is looking at the woman caught. She's in all of her sin. And, there's a crowd around Jesus of religious people with rocks in their hand because that's a cultural context. They were ready to stone her for her sin. And I could picture myself in the crowd with the rock, with all that hurt and all that hatred and anger and vengeance, everything was in me that was just holding me back from experiencing happiness. And it was almost like as I read this story and I just was more curious perhaps, or God met me there, it's almost like he moved me around to the other side of the woman. And out of the crowd, and now I'm on the other side of the woman. I'm not looking at Jesus's back, but I'm looking at his face, and I'm looking at the woman and the crowd and all their anger. And it's like he gave me another perspective, and the other perspective is I looked into the eyes of Jesus when he saw this woman in all of her brokenness and all of her sin, and I saw his eyes of compassion. I saw his eyes of mercy. I saw his eyes of truth where he said, don't sin any longer. But it was a moment that God met me and really kind of empowered me to go, you know what? Jesus looks up at me in that moment and he goes, Buck, I've forgiven you. And I've forgiven her. And I've forgiven that individual for what they've done. Now you are to forgive as I have forgiven you, just as the scriptures say. But it took that private discipline to create that moment for me that actually empowered me to do something I did not want to do, which actually freed me to begin to experience healing and begin to experience that joy and the delight and the happiness in my life. And that was legitimate through a private discipline. So when I say read the scriptures and, sometimes that can sound like, churchy and,
yeah,
it's real, it's tangible. And I'm just telling you, God will meet you time and time again if you're curious, if you're looking for it. And so, again.
Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite verses in Genesis is from Joseph when he's after his brothers, throw him out and they tell their dad that he's dead, he's gone, and there's this whole thing. And then he goes to Egypt, and then he becomes really influential in Egypt, and he finally meets his brothers, and they apologize, and then he responds to them, and he says, yeah, what you intended for bad, God intended for good. And Joseph had that happiness, that contentment, that joy. I've always loved that statement. What you intended for bad, God intended for good. And we see things differently when we go through something like you just talked about. And that's where going back to what you said, what's going to shake us up to experience happiness, potentially something really hard in life that feels like the opposite of happiness. But on the other side of it, there's just something fresh and new, in our heart and in our soul about it. So last question. I've thought about this recently because I have a friend of mine who is kind of exploring Christianity a little bit. And one of the things they told me, it was just perplexing to them, a family member they have that's gone through a lot of hard things with kids and just death and sickness and things like that. And they're Christians. And he told me every time that they visit, they're some of the happiest people that they've ever met. and that they've ever known, and they're always happy despite what's going on, and they're Christians. And it's always been perplexing to him is how he described it, how they hold on to this happiness, right? And one of my favorite quotes from Eugene Peterson, he's the late Eugene Peterson, he has a book called The Long Obedience in the Same Direction. And it just talks about how kind of the long journey, not a destination, of walking with Jesus. And one of the quotes is, a Christian should be a hallelujah from head to toe. Meaning, like, when you meet a Christian, they should be the happiest people on the planet. My friend's experience should be what happens. Now, what I know often happens is not that, And so why do you think that is? Why do you think more Christians seem happy?
Yeah, it is a fantastic question because, Jesus over and over, and the scriptures over and over talk about the idea that, we should be a light on the hill. Like, by the way that you love, people are going to go, oh, I'm curious, and Jesus calls us to love as he loved. And so you look at that, and then, the tension point is, well, if knowing God and experiencing his love, the natural byproduct of that is happiness and joy and delight and pleasure, then you wonder, why don't I see more Christians like this? And I think it's a fair question, but I also think it's really important to back up a couple steps. And if you're a Christian listening to this, or if you're not a Christian, I really think it's important to give all of us a whole lot of grace and to be perhaps a whole lot more patient and understanding. And what I mean by that is oftentimes with the example you used, we look at what the final, not the final, but that somebody has achieved something. And we go like, I want that. I want to do that. And if that individual is at a state to where they really do feel that perpetual, lasting, long-term, foundational happiness, they're probably going to look at you and they're going to go, if you want what I have, you have to do what I did. You want what I'm doing. You want what I'm experiencing. But you got to go back to the years and the years and the years and do what I did to get what I have. And it's like anybody like, hey, I want to be a famous writer. Well, fantastic. Like, how many years of failure did that writer, write, and the disciplines and the years of like success and fail. And finally, like famous athletes, so many of them go, man, if you like the work ethic, I mean, if you saw all the times that, I didn't get the starting position, or all the times that I hit the weight room, or all the times that, I watched film, I watched a documentary on Tom Brady, you got to do what he did to have a chance to begin to experience what he's experiencing.
Yeah.
So I say that to go, I think when somebody becomes a Christian, we just need to give ourselves a lot of grace, because you're bringing in things that, just like I did and have, and still, things of the past, like choices in our past that really feel like they have a lot of energy, and there's a lot of shame around those, and you feel terrible about, I can't believe I did that in my 20s. I can't believe I did that in my teenage years. Or you bring into your Christianity things of like, that have happened to you, injustices that have either happened to you, tragedies that have happened to you that you still have a lot of questions about, or injustices that maybe you have done that you still have a lot of shame and guilt about. You bring in your religious baggage, depending on what church you grew up in, and, the religious context that they provided. And even if that's, incorrect, and now you've got, maybe a lot of guilt associated with Christianity and God. And, you believe the pictures you see of Jesus with this guy who always looks like he's mad and, or like this really stoic, versus I think the picture of the scriptures paint is a much more joyful, happy, delightful Jesus. I mean, kids love to be around Jesus. That's an indicator that, man, kids love to be around people who are happy.
Yeah.
And that kids love Jesus. So my point with all of that is, I think we are seeing outcomes. And we should give ourselves perhaps a little bit more grace if you're a Christian or not, and a little bit more empathy if you're a Christian or not, because we're all a work in progress. And I think if that's where we're at, and that's what we're seeing, and maybe you're not experiencing that in your personal life, my encouragement would say keep going. Put one foot in front of the other. The things that I alluded to earlier, the disciplines and, listening to different teachings and so on. I understand we want it in an instant gratification culture, but we got to keep going and give ourselves grace. And there's healing that needs to happen from our past. There's counselors we need to get in front of to begin to unpack some of the things we've chosen. And how do we forgive ourselves? How do we see ourselves as God sees us? and see ourselves as redeemed, to see ourselves as forgiven. That begins to free us. The more we give ourselves grace, the more we continue to take steps of progression. And then what you described is your friend and the outcome. They faced a lot of tragedies, but there's a statement I heard one time that says, you can take my house, you can take my wife, you can take my kids, but you cannot take my Jesus. The very thing that's inside of you, regardless if you're in prison or if you're free, whatever, you cannot take that. Mm-hmm. And that is where joy is found. That's where the foundation is found. And that's probably what your friend saw in his family, is they have a foundation. Everything is certainly on top of it, and they have to be human and feel it. But that probably took years and years and years and years and years of doing. And then what they were able to experience and achieve is that long-term happiness. Yeah. That tragedy can come my way. You can take a lot of things from me, but you can't take Jesus. And he's the one to provide joy. So long answer, but that's what I think.
No, that's great. That's really helpful. I think it supports a lot of what I've experienced in my life too. The happiest people I've met, typically, there's probably 4 or 5 people in my mind that I would put them in the category of the happiest people. Mm-hmm. They've gone through some of the hardest things imaginable.
Sure.
And they've done the work to come out on the other side and be able to see life differently as a result. Mm-hmm. Some people, it's just hard to do the work sometimes, but and we're all in process too.
Yeah. And happiness is, the thing I want to be really careful, because I think even on Sunday after Sunday, I was like, did I communicate this? I'm not communicating that your disposition needs to be happy-go-lucky. Mm-hmm. And you're like, I'm smiley and I'm the joy of the room. Some of the most, some people with dispositions that seem like reserved and seem very quiet, and you wonder if they're happy. They're some of the most joyful, happy, incredible people that have influenced my life. Mm-hmm. They just have a different disposition.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got to be really careful with, I'm not saying you need to be happy-go-lucky.
Yeah.
I'm just saying there's something internal. There's an internal foundation that's at a soulish level that just provides a sustaining joy, a sustaining peace, a sustaining happiness, that really believes that Romans 8:28, God is working all things for the good, even when I can't see them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great. That's a great way to wrap up the podcast. Buck, thanks so much.
Yeah.
It's been an incredible series, super helpful, and thanks for unpacking more of what's going on in your brain as you think through these things. Next week, speaking of brain, we are jumping into a series called In Your Head, all about mental health, anxiety, and depression. I'm really excited. It's going to be a great conversation over the next month. And so, make sure to be there. We'll see you either online or in person for the start of this new series. Buck, Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeremy.